A lone black rancher is cornered by 14 hired guns, ready to take her land. But what her cattle did next left everyone in the dust-choked corral speechless. The lead man, a brute named Jed, spat on the ground. "This is over, Clara. Sign the papers or we'll make you." She stood firm, her eyes as hard as the dry Texas earth beneath her boots. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she let out a low, sharp whistle. In that instant, the ground began to tremble. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and unexpected loyalty, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and comment below with your city and the word justice to show your support for Clara. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light. The story begins in the vast, unforgiving plains of West Texas. This was Clara's world. A world of scorching sun, endless sky, and the low, constant rumble of her cattle. She was a woman carved from the land itself, strong, quiet, and unyielding. At 58, she had worked this ranch, the Ironwood Creek Ranch, her entire life. It had been her father's, and his father's before him. It was more than just property. It was blood, sweat, and legacy baked into the soil. Her days were a simple rhythm: sunrise chores, mending fences, tending to her herd, and ending the day watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. She knew every one of her longhorns by name, especially Titan, the massive lead bull whose trust she had earned over years of mutual respect. But that peace was a fragile thing. For the past 6 months, a shadow had been creeping over Ironwood Creek. That shadow had a name: Colonel Morrison, a wealthy land developer from Dallas with eyes that saw everything as a commodity. He wanted Clara's land. It sat on a massive underground aquifer, a priceless resource in the arid state, and he planned to build a luxury resort, the Oasis Springs Resort, promising jobs and prosperity. But his promises were poison. He had already bought out or forced out every other small rancher in the county. Only Clara remained. She refused every offer, tore up every letter, and ignored every threat. Her land was not for sale. This refusal had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to this very moment. The letters had become more aggressive. Fences were mysteriously cut at night. Her well was tampered with. Clara knew it was Morrison's work, but she had no proof that would stand up against a man with deep pockets and deeper connections. The confrontation in the corral was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. She knew this day was coming, a day when Morrison would stop sending letters and start sending men. What she didn't know was that this day would change everything, revealing an alliance she had forged not with people, but with the very creatures she had dedicated her life to. The loyalty of her herd was an untested weapon, a secret she held close. Was it possible that beasts could understand justice better than men? The afternoon sun was relentless. 14 men, hired muscle from out of state, fanned out around the main corral. They were a mix of weathered roughnecks and young thugs trying to look tough. Their leader, Jed, stepped forward. He was a big man with a cruel smile and a silver belt buckle that glinted in the sun. He held out a clipboard with a stack of papers. "Colonel Morrison is making you a final offer, Clara," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "A generous one considering your situation." Clara stood her ground near the corral gate, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She didn't look at the papers. She looked at Jed. "I already gave the colonel my answer. This ranch isn't for sale." "That wasn't a request," Jed sneered. He took a step closer. The other men shifted, their hands hovering near their belts. The air grew thick with tension. Inside the corral, the longhorns became restless. They shuffled their hooves, their massive horns clacking together. Titan the bull stood near the fence, his dark eyes fixed on Jed. He let out a low, guttural bellow. One of Jed's men laughed nervously. "Looks like your pet doesn't like us much." "He's a good judge of character," Clara replied, her voice flat. Jed's smile vanished. "Enough of this. You're a stubborn old woman standing in the way of progress." You can either sign this paper and walk away with something, or we can escort you off your property and you'll walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back." He shoved the clipboard toward her. Clara didn't move. "You and what army?" Jed chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. He gestured to the men surrounding her. "This army, 14 of us against one of you. The odds aren't in your favor." "You're wrong," Clara said softly. "You're not counting right." Before Jed could process her words, Clara turned her head slightly toward the corral. She let out that whistle, a sound she used to call the herd, sharp and clear. It cut through the oppressive heat. It wasn't a call for food or a signal to move pastures. This one was different. It carried an urgency, a command. In response, Titan roared. It wasn't a simple bellow, it was a thunderous declaration of war. He slammed his 2,000-pound body against the wooden corral gate. The thick timber groaned under the impact. The other longhorns, agitated and responsive, began to move as one, a wave of muscle and horn surging behind their leader. Jed and his men took an involuntary step back. Their confident smirks were replaced with confusion, then alarm. "What the hell is she doing?" one of them yelled. "It's just a dumb animal," Jed spat, trying to regain control. "Settle it down." But it was too late. Titan hit the gate again. This time there was a loud crack. The wood splintered, the hinges screamed. With a third final impact, the gate exploded outward, torn from its moorings. The path was clear. A tide of over 100 longhorns, led by a furious bull, poured out of the corral. They weren't scattering in fear. They were charging. Their eyes were wild, their hooves churning the dry earth into a blinding cloud of dust, and they were charging straight for Jed and his 14 men. Chaos was absolute. The hired guns, who moments before had been the picture of smug intimidation, were now a frantic mess of flailing limbs and panicked shouts. The ground shook under the weight of 100 charging animals. Titan was at the forefront, a living battering ram of muscle and horn, his target locked on Jed. The man's face went pale. He fumbled for the pistol at his hip, but there was no time. Titan lowered his head, and the tip of one massive horn, 6 feet long and sharp as a spear, caught Jed in the side, lifting him off his feet and tossing him through the air like a rag doll. He landed hard in a cloud of dust, the wind knocked out of him, the clipboard with Morrison's contract fluttering down beside him. The other men scattered. Some tried to climb the fences of the other pens, their boots slipping on the wooden rails. One man wasn't fast enough and was sideswiped by a stampeding cow, sent sprawling into a water trough. Another made a desperate dive into the bed of their parked pickup truck, landing with a painful thud. The trucks themselves became obstacles. The herd flowed around them, their horns scraping paint and shattering windows. It wasn't a malicious, targeted attack on every man. It was a force of nature, a violent rejection of their presence. The men were simply in the way of the herd's protective fury. Clara stood perfectly still amidst the storm she had unleashed. The cattle parted around her as if she were a rock in a river, their bodies brushing against her but never threatening her. She watched as the last of the terrified thugs scrambled into their vehicles. Engines roared to life, tires spun in the dirt, kicking up rocks and dust as they fled down the long driveway, leaving a trail of chaos behind them. Jed, clutching his ribs and gasping for air, was hauled into the passenger seat of the lead truck. His face, contorted with pain and humiliation, was visible for a moment through the shattered windshield. He locked eyes with Clara, and his expression was pure venom. It was a promise of retribution. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The rumble of hooves subsided as the herd slowed, milling about in the open space, their adrenaline slowly fading. The dust began to settle, revealing the wreckage. The broken corral gate, deep gouges in the dirt, a shattered truck window and the forgotten clipboard lying half-buried in the dust. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the cattle and the whisper of the Texas wind. Clara walked calmly toward Titan. The great bull stood panting, his sides heaving. He turned his massive head as she approached, and his dark eyes, which had been wild with fury, softened. She reached out and placed a hand on his broad forehead, right between the base of his horns. "Good boy, Titan," she murmured, her voice steady. "You did good." He let out a low rumble, a sound of contentment, and nudged her hand gently. She spent the next few minutes walking through her herd, speaking to them in low tones, calming them, her presence a balm after the violent outburst. This was her family, her army, and they had answered her call without hesitation. About 20 minutes later, another cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, this one from a single vehicle approaching at a steady official pace, a county sheriff's car. It pulled up near the broken corral, and Sheriff Brody stepped out. He was a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and a tired expression that suggested he'd seen too much of what men like Morrison could do. He and Clara had known each other for years. He adjusted his hat, his eyes taking in the scene of destruction. "Clara," he said, his voice flat, "got a call about a disturbance out here. One of Jedediah Clay's boys sounded like he was crying. Said they were attacked." Clara didn't flinch. "They were trespassing, Sheriff." Brody walked over to the splintered remains of the gate. He nudged a piece of wood with the toe of his boot. "This looks like more than trespassing. Looks like a stampede." "My cattle got spooked," she said simply. "A bunch of loud men in big trucks, shouting and making threats. You know how animals can be." The sheriff sighed and looked at her. He knew she was telling him a carefully constructed fraction of the truth. He also knew whose side he'd rather be on. "Making threats? What kind of threats?" "The kind Colonel Morrison pays for," she answered, picking up the discarded clipboard. She handed it to him. "They wanted me to sign this. Said they'd escort me off my own land if I didn't." Brody scanned the legal document. His jaw tightened. He'd seen papers like this before, all over the county. They were legal, but the methods used to get them signed were anything but. "This is his final offer," it says. "It was," Clara confirmed. "And you're telling me your herd just happened to get spooked and run them off at that exact moment?" Brody asked, his gaze unwavering. "Sometimes things just work out that way," Clara said, her expression unreadable. A long silence passed between them. Brody knew he couldn't prove a thing. There were no witnesses except for Morrison's men, and their credibility was zero. He also knew this was a dangerous escalation. Morrison wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He would twist this. "Clara, you need to be careful," Brody warned, handing the clipboard back. "You know how he operates. He'll go to the papers, he'll go to the county judge, he'll paint you as a menace, he'll say you sicked a dangerous animal on his employees, he'll try to get a court order to have Titan put down." The thought sent a chill through Clara, colder than any winter wind. Titan was more than livestock, he was her partner. "Let him try." "I'm serious," Brody pressed. "He will use the law against you. He'll tie you up in legal fees you can't afford. He'll turn public opinion. He's not going to send thugs next time. He's going to send lawyers, and they're far more dangerous." "I appreciate the warning, Bill," she said, using his first name for the first time in the conversation. "But this is my home. My father is buried on that hill over there. I'm not running." Sheriff Brody looked from Clara's determined face to the massive bull standing watchfully behind her, then back at the tire tracks peeling away into the distance. He was a man of the law, but the law was being used as a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. "All right, Clara," he said, heading back to his car. "Officially, my report will say that a group of men were reported for trespassing, and upon my arrival, they were gone. The property owner reported some damage to a fence, likely caused by spooked livestock. That's all I saw." "Thank you, Bill," she said. He paused before getting in his car. "Just watch your back. This hornet's nest has been kicked, and the hornets are coming." As Sheriff Brody drove away, Clara stood alone in the quiet aftermath. She knew he was right. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of war. The first battle had been won with horns and hooves, but the next would be fought with words, lies, and money. and Colonel Morrison had an endless supply of all three. 200 miles away, in a glass-walled office overlooking the Dallas skyline, Colonel Morrison listened to Jed's report. Jed sat uncomfortably in a leather chair that was far too expensive for him, a fresh bandage visible beneath his shirt. 2 of his ribs were cracked. His pride was shattered. "Let me get this straight," Morrison said, his voice dangerously calm. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clinking softly. "I sent 14 armed men, whom I paid a significant amount of money to get a signature from one woman, and you came back with nothing but bruises and a story about a rampaging cow." "It wasn't just a cow, sir," Jed stammered, wincing as he shifted his weight. "It was the bull, Titan. She sicked it on us. It was like she was controlling it." Morrison took a slow sip of his whiskey. He wasn't a man who believed in animal whisperers or mystical bonds. He believed in leverage, money, and power. Clara had embarrassed him. She had defied him. And now she had physically repelled his forces. This was no longer just a business transaction. It was personal. "She didn't sick anything on you, Jedediah," Morrison said, setting his glass down with a sharp click. "You and your men were incompetent. You let an old woman and a farm animal make you look like fools." He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of ice. "Get out of my office. Send the doctor's bill to my accountant. You're finished." Jed's face fell, but he knew better than to argue. He limped out of the office, leaving Morrison alone with his view and his fury. The colonel stared out at the city for a long moment. Brute force had failed. It was time for a more sophisticated, more vicious attack. It was time to use the weapons he wielded best, public opinion and the law. Sheriff Brody's prediction came true with terrifying speed. 2 days later, the front page of the West Texas Chronicle featured a large, unflattering photo of Clara's ranch entrance. The headline was bold and inflammatory. "Rancher unleashes vicious beast on development workers." Clara read the article standing in the aisle of Miller's Feed and Supply, the newspaper trembling slightly in her hands. The story painted a harrowing picture. It quoted 2 of Jed's men, who remained anonymous, describing a premeditated and unprovoked attack. They claimed they were there to present a fair and generous business proposal when Clara, in a fit of rage, incited her dangerously aggressive bull to charge them. Jed was described as a project foreman who was severely injured while trying to protect his crew. The article included a lengthy quote from Colonel Morrison himself. "We are deeply concerned for the safety of the community," he stated. "While we respect private property rights, no one has the right to harbor a dangerous animal that poses a clear and present threat to human life. We were simply there to discuss a project that would bring jobs and economic growth to the area. We were met with violence. We will be exploring all legal options to ensure this never happens again." The words were a calculated masterstroke. He wasn't the villain. He was the concerned citizen. Clara wasn't the victim. She was the dangerous recluse. The change in the town was immediate and palpable. When Clara went to the counter to pay for her feed, the clerk, a young woman who usually greeted her with a smile, barely made eye contact. An old acquaintance, Martha, who was in the next aisle, suddenly found something fascinating about a shelf of canned goods and turned her back. Whispers followed her out the door. She could feel the eyes on her, the mix of fear and judgment. Morrison's poison was already seeping into the community well. She drove home with a knot in her stomach. Her reputation, built over a lifetime of hard work and quiet dignity, was being dismantled by a few paragraphs of lies. When she pulled up to her house, she saw an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked in her driveway. A man in a crisp, tailored suit stood by her porch, holding a leather briefcase. He looked completely out of place against the backdrop of the dusty ranch. "Clara Mayhew?" he asked as she got out of her truck. His voice was smooth and professional. "I am," she said, her guard up. "My name is Arthur Vance. "I'm an attorney with the firm representing Morrison Development," he said, extending a thick envelope toward her. "You've been served." Clara took the envelope. Her hands felt numb. "This is a summons," Vance explained, his tone devoid of any emotion. "Mr. Morrison is suing you for damages to his vehicles, medical expenses for his injured employee, and punitive damages for assault. Furthermore, we have filed a petition with the county court. We are seeking an injunction to have the animal known as Titan declared a public nuisance and a dangerous animal. The petition calls for the animal to be impounded and euthanized." Each word was a hammer blow. Euthanized. They were going to kill Titan. They were going to take her protector, her friend, and put him down like he was nothing. "You can't do that," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We can, and we will," the lawyer said coolly. "The law is quite clear on animals that have attacked humans. You have 30 days to respond to the summons. I suggest you retain legal counsel. Good day, Ms. Mayhew." He turned, got back into his air-conditioned car and drove away, leaving her standing in the oppressive heat with the legal documents in her hand. She opened the envelope and stared at the dense, incomprehensible text. It was a language she didn't speak, from a world she didn't understand. She saw Morrison's name, her name, and the word euthanasia. She looked out toward the pasture where Titan was grazing peacefully under the vast Texas sky. He was the symbol of her defiance, the living embodiment of her will to fight. And now Morrison had made him the target. The colonel wasn't just trying to take her land anymore. He was trying to break her spirit by destroying the one thing he knew she would die to protect. The war had moved from her dusty corral to a courtroom, a place where she had no allies, and her best soldier was the one they intended to execute. Undefined. For a long moment, Clara just stood there, the legal papers feeling heavier than a sack of feed. The silence of the ranch, usually a comfort, now felt like a suffocating blanket of isolation. Every whisper of the wind seemed to mock her. She was alone, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy who could turn the law itself into a weapon. The rage that had protected her in the corral was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Morrison wasn't just coming for her land anymore. He was coming for Titan's life. The next morning, after a sleepless night, she drove into town. Not to the feed store or the diner, but to a small, dusty office above the hardware store. The sign on the door was faded. Samuel Jones, attorney at law. Sam Jones was a semi-retired lawyer in his late 60s, a man known more for his grumpy demeanor and his losing battles against the county than for any legal victories. He was, however, the only lawyer in a 50-mile radius who might take a case without a $5,000 retainer. Clara found him hunched over a desk piled high with yellowing case files. He looked up over his reading glasses, his expression already weary. "What is it?" he grunted. She placed the summons and the petition on his desk. "I need a lawyer." Sam picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the first page. He let out a low whistle. "Morrison Development." "You're the woman from the newspaper." He didn't say it like an accusation, just a statement of fact. He read through the documents in silence for several minutes, his frown deepening with every page. Finally, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Ms. Mayhew," he began, his voice gravelly, "you are in a world of trouble. He's suing you for assault with a deadly bull, and he's petitioning to have the animal destroyed. This isn't about property damage. This is a character assassination designed to break you." "The story in the paper was all lies," Clara said, her voice tight. "They came to my land, 14 of them. They threatened me. Titan was just protecting me." "I believe you," Sam said, surprising her. "But it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what a judge believes. Morrison has a dozen paid witnesses who will all swear to the same story. You have one witness, and you're the defendant. Your bull unfortunately can't testify." The hopelessness of it all washed over her again. "So, what do I do?" "You fight," Sam said, a flicker of something other than cynicism in his eyes. But you need to understand what you're up against. His lawyers will file motions, requests for depositions, endless paperwork. They'll try to bleed you dry before you ever set foot in a courtroom. Their goal is to make this so expensive and so miserable that you'll give up, sign over the land, and let them kill your bull just to make it all stop. I'm not giving up, Clara said, her voice regaining its strength. And they are not touching Titan. Sam looked at her, a long, appraising stare. He'd seen plenty of people crushed by the system. He saw a different kind of fire in Clara. All right, my fee is $100 an hour. I'll need a $200 retainer to file our response. And I'll be honest with you, our chances are slim to none. Slim is better than none, Clara said, pulling a worn leather wallet from her pocket. She counted out 4 $50 bills and placed them on the desk. It was a significant portion of her savings. The first step had been taken, but the public battle was getting worse. A few days later, needing supplies she couldn't get at the feed store, she went to the Dusty Spoon Cafe for a cup of coffee. As she walked in, the place went quiet. Jim, the owner, who had known her for 30 years, stopped wiping the counter. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Morning, Jim," she said, her voice steady. He cleared his throat. "Clara, I don't think it's a good idea for you to be in here. I just want a cup of coffee," she said. A man at the counter, a fellow rancher she recognized, turned on his stool. "We don't want any trouble, Clara. People are spooked, talking about that beast of yours." The humiliation was a physical blow. To be treated like a stranger, a threat, in a place that had been a part of her life for so long. Her face remained a mask of calm, but inside, she was reeling. "I understand," she said quietly. She turned and walked out, the silence of the diner following her into the street. As she reached her truck, a hand touched her arm. She turned to see Maria Sanchez, a woman whose husband had owned the ranch bordering hers to the south. Morrison had bought them out a year ago. They now lived in a small rental house in town. "Don't listen to them, Clara," Maria whispered, her eyes full of a sad understanding. "They're scared. Morrison owns the bank that holds their loans. He's a sponsor for the high school football team. He has his hooks in everything. He's turning the whole county against me," Clara said. "He did the same to us," Maria said, her voice bitter. "He promised us a good price, then found a dozen environmental issues and zoning problems during the inspection. The price kept dropping until we had no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar or face foreclosure. He ruins people." She pressed a folded piece of paper into Clara's hand. "This is my number. There are others who he's hurt. We've been too scared to speak up, but seeing you fight, maybe it's time." Clara looked at the paper, then at Maria. It was the first sign that she wasn't completely alone. A small crack in the wall of isolation Morrison had built around her. When she got back to the ranch, a new violation awaited her. Parked along the public road that bordered her property line were 2 white trucks from Apex Surveying Co. 3 men were setting up tripods and electronic equipment. They weren't on her land, but they were as close as they could get. They were surveying the perimeter, driving stakes with bright orange ribbons into the ground every 50 feet. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a constant visible reminder that Morrison was there, at her gates, measuring the land he intended to take. They worked all afternoon, the beeps of their equipment a constant irritant, their presence an invasion. Clara watched them from her porch, her hands clenched into fists. The fear and despair she had felt were burning away, replaced by a cold, hard anger. Morrison had lied. He had turned her neighbors against her. He had threatened her home and the life of her closest companion. And now he was taunting her. He thought he had her cornered. He thought he had already won. She looked over at the pasture. Titan was watching the surveyors, his head held high, his body tense. He was ready to fight. And so was she. This was no longer about defense. This was about payback. The anger simmering inside Clara was a different kind of fuel. It was sharp, focused, and it burned away the last of her fear. She looked at the number Maria had given her. It was time to stop reacting and start acting. That evening, she made the call. "Hello?" Maria's voice was cautious. "Maria, it's Clara Mayhew." There was a pause, then a sigh of relief. "Clara, I'm glad you called. Is everything okay?" "No," Clara said bluntly, "but I'm not going to let him win. You said there were others that Morrison pushed out." "There are," Maria confirmed. "The Jacksons, Old Man Hemlock, the Miller family. At least half a dozen that I know of. He strong-armed every one of them." "I want to talk to them," Clara said, her tone resolute. "I want to hear their stories, every detail, every threat, every lie." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Clara could hear the fear in that silence. "People are afraid to talk, Clara. He could make things even worse for them. He's trying to get a court order to kill my bull," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "He's suing me for everything I have. He's already made things as bad as they can be for me. What do I have left to lose? Maybe if we all stand together, our stories will be louder than his money." Her conviction seemed to break through Maria's hesitation. "Okay," Maria said, her voice firmer now. "I'll make some calls. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. Meet at my house tomorrow night, after dark." The next evening, Clara drove to the small, nondescript house on the edge of town. Inside, gathered in Maria's cramped living room, were 5 other people. Their faces were etched with worry and defeat. There was Tom Jackson, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease from the garage he'd been forced to sell. There was Sarah Miller, a young widow with 2 children who had lost her family's farm. And there was old Mr. Hemlock, who sat silently in a corner, his eyes vacant, having lost the land his great-grandfather had settled. One by one, they told their stories. They were all variations on the same theme. Morrison would make a public, generous offer. Then, the problems would start. A sudden, failed inspection from a county official. A well that mysteriously went dry. A bank loan suddenly called in. Then came the revised lowball offers, presented as a final chance to escape ruin. They had all been isolated, picked off one by one, made to feel like they were the only ones failing. As Clara listened, a pattern emerged, a crucial piece of the puzzle. "The inspections," she said, cutting through a story Tom was telling. "The county inspector. Was it a man named Peterson? Short, bald, with a gold tooth?" Tom Jackson's eyes widened. "Yeah, that was him." "How'd you know?" Sarah Miller nodded. "He came to my place too, said my septic system was in violation of a code that didn't even exist, quoted me a repair cost that was more than the farm was worth. He was at my ranch 2 months ago," Clara said, the pieces clicking into place. "Said my well water had contaminants, wanted a bribe to make the report go away. I threw him off my property." It was the key. Morrison wasn't just using lawyers and public opinion. He had a man on the inside. A corrupt county official who was creating the leverage Morrison needed. This wasn't just unethical business, it was a criminal conspiracy. She took this new information to Sam Jones the next morning. For the first time, she saw the old lawyer's weary expression change to one of sharp, predatory interest. "Frank Peterson," Sam mused, leaning back in his chair. "He's been the county land inspector for 20 years, always lived beyond his means. Drives a new car every year." He tapped his fingers on the desk. "This is it, Clara. This is the crack in his armor. If we can prove Peterson was falsifying reports on Morrison's behalf in exchange for money, the whole case against you falls apart. Better yet, it becomes a criminal case against them." "How do we prove it?" Clara asked. "We need one of them to flip," Sam said. "The problem is, these people you met with are terrified. They won't testify in open court. Morrison would crush them." He looked at Clara, an idea forming in his mind. "But maybe we don't need them to testify. Maybe we just need to make Morrison think they will." The plan was simple, and it was a bluff. But it was the only card they had to play. Sam drafted a new set of legal documents. It was a countersuit. Clara Mayhew versus Morrison Development. But this time, she wasn't the only plaintiff. Listed below her name were the names of every family Morrison had forced out: the Jacksons, the Millers, Hemlock, the Sanchezes, and 2 others. They hadn't officially agreed to join the suit, but their names were on the paper. The countersuit didn't just deny Morrison's claims, it made explosive new ones. It alleged a pattern of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. It specifically named County Inspector Frank Peterson as a co-conspirator. It claimed that Morrison and Peterson had engaged in a systematic scheme to devalue properties through fraudulent inspections in order to acquire them illegally. "This is a declaration of war," Sam said as he prepared to file the papers. "When Morrison sees this, he's going to do one of 2 things. He'll either bury us in legal motions and try to prove we're lying, or he'll panic. He'll worry that we have proof, that one of his victims has a recording, a document, something. And his first move will be to clean up his loose ends." "You mean Peterson?" Clara said. "Exactly," Sam confirmed. "He'll need to shut Peterson up, make sure his story stays bought and paid for. And when he does that, he's going to get sloppy." 2 days after the countersuit was filed, the phone in Sam's office rang. It was Sheriff Brody. "Sam!" Brody's voice was low and urgent. "Something's happening. I just got an anonymous tip." A man matching Frank Peterson's description was seen being forced into a black SUV out behind the Cattleman's Steakhouse not 20 minutes ago. The tipster said the men looked like the same type that were out at Clara's ranch. Sam's heart pounded. The bluff had worked. Morrison had taken the bait. Where would they take him, Bill? "If they want to have a quiet, persuasive conversation," Brody said grimly, "there's only one place private enough for that. The old abandoned slaughterhouse off Highway 84. It's on property Morrison bought last year. Clara's on her way into town," Sam said, thinking fast. "I'll call her. We need proof, Bill. We need to catch them in the act." "My hands are tied until I have probable cause to get a warrant," the sheriff said, his frustration clear. "I can't just raid his property based on an anonymous tip. But if someone, a private citizen, happened to see something and record it on their phone, well, that would be a different story. That would be the evidence I need." The message was unspoken but clear. The law couldn't act, but Clara could. The war wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It had moved to a dark, abandoned slaughterhouse, and the fate of her ranch, her bull, and her future now depended on what she would do next. Sam's call caught Clara just as she was pulling into town. He explained the situation quickly, his voice stripped of its usual grumpiness, replaced by a raw urgency. Brody's message was clear. He was giving her a chance to get the proof the law couldn't. This was no longer about legal maneuvers. This was dangerous, and it was happening now. Clara didn't hesitate. She turned her old pickup truck around, the tires kicking up gravel. The abandoned slaughterhouse was a place locals avoided. A hulking, rusted metal structure that sat decaying in a field of weeds, surrounded by a sagging chain-link fence. It was a place of ghosts and bad memories, the perfect location for a conversation no one was meant to overhear. She parked her truck on a dirt track a quarter-mile away, hidden by a stand of mesquite trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. She slipped through a gap in the fence, her boots making no sound on the dry ground. Every instinct she'd honed over a lifetime of tracking cattle and reading the land was now focused on this new, more dangerous quarry. A black SUV was parked near a side entrance to the main building, its engine ticking as it cooled. Clara circled around, staying low, using the derelict cattle pens for cover. She found a grimy window, streaked with years of filth, and peered inside. The scene was stark. In the middle of a vast concrete room, Frank Peterson was tied to a steel chair. His face was bruised, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. Standing over him was Jed, the man Titan had tossed aside. His ribs were clearly still bothering him, but the look on his face was one of pure, sadistic pleasure. 2 other thugs stood by the door, acting as lookouts, and then a 4th man stepped out of the shadows. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. It was Colonel Morrison. He was holding a phone to his ear. "No, Arthur, this is just a minor housekeeping matter," Morrison said into the phone, his voice calm and controlled, as if he were discussing a business lunch. "Our friend Mr. Peterson was feeling a bit talkative. We're simply reminding him of the terms of our arrangement." Clara's hand went to her own phone. She fumbled with the screen, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and hit the record button. She propped the phone against the window pane, angling it to capture the entire scene. Morrison ended his call and slipped the phone into his pocket. He walked over to Peterson. Frank, he said, his voice laced with mock disappointment. "I hear there's a nasty lawsuit floating around with your name in it. A lawsuit that claims you and I have been working together. Now, we both know that's not true, don't we?" Peterson, terrified, shook his head frantically. "No, Sir Colonel. It's lies, all lies. I'd never say anything." I'm glad to hear that," Morrison said smoothly. "But this woman, this Clara Mayhew, she seems to have gotten it into her head that you might be a weak link. So I need your signature on one more document, an affidavit. It states that you have never accepted any payment from me, that all your inspections were legitimate, and that Ms. Mayhew, in fact, tried to bribe you, and you refused. It's all typed up and ready." Jed produced a clipboard, much like the one he'd tried to force on Clara, and held it in front of Peterson. "Sign it," Jed growled. I can't," Peterson whimpered. "My hands." Morrison sighed, a theatrical sound of impatience. "Jed, be a dear and help the man." Jed grabbed Peterson's hand, forcing a pen into his grip, and began to trace the man's signature on the line. At that moment, one of the lookouts by the door stiffened. "Boss," he said nervously, "there's a car coming." Headlights just turned onto the access road. Morrison's face hardened. "Who? I told you no one was to follow us." "Looks like the sheriff," the man said, peering out a crack in the door. Panic flared in Morrison's eyes. He had been set up. The countersuit wasn't just a legal filing, it was bait. He looked at Peterson, then at Jed. His carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. "Leave him," Morrison snapped. "Get to the car. We're leaving now. Go, go." He didn't wait for his men. He sprinted for the SUV, his composure gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man who was about to be caught. Jed and his men scrambled after him, leaving Peterson tied to the chair. The SUV's engine roared to life, and it sped away, fishtailing in the dirt, just as Sheriff Brody's car, lights flashing but siren silent, pulled in from the other side. Clara grabbed her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had it. She had everything. Morrison's voice, the threats, the forced signature, it was all there. She met Brody as he was getting out of his car, his gun drawn. "They just left," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Peterson's inside, tied up." Brody gave her a quick, questioning look. She held up her phone. "I recorded it, Bill. I got it all." A slow smile spread across the sheriff's weary face. "Well, I'll be," he said. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Brody. I'm at the old slaughterhouse on 84. I have an assault victim and evidence of a kidnapping. Put out an APB on a black Lincoln Navigator, license plate." He read the plate number Clara had mentally noted. "Suspects are armed and dangerous. The primary suspect is Colonel James Morrison." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Morrison. With the video Clara provided, Brody had more than enough to get his warrant. He arrested Morrison and Jed 2 hours later at a private airfield as they were attempting to board a jet to Mexico. Frank Peterson, once rescued, gave a full confession, detailing years of fraud and bribery, implicating not just Morrison, but 2 other county officials. The news hit the West Texas Chronicle like a bombshell. The headline this time was different. Developer Morrison arrested in racketeering probe. Rancher hailed as hero. The story of Clara's stand, her clever legal trap, and her bravery at the slaughterhouse spread like wildfire. The narrative had completely flipped. She was no longer the dangerous recluse. She was the giant slayer, the woman who had exposed the corruption that had been poisoning their county for years. The lawsuit against her was dropped immediately. The petition to have Titan euthanized was thrown out of court with prejudice. Sam Jones, grinning from ear to ear, informed her that with Peterson's testimony, their countersuit was now a slam dunk. The families Morrison had displaced were joining the suit for real this time, armed with the courage Clara had given them. They were going to get their justice, and likely a settlement that would dwarf anything Morrison had ever paid them. The change in town was just as swift. The next time Clara walked into the Dusty Spoon Cafe, the place didn't fall silent. It erupted in applause. Jim, the owner, rushed over, his face full of shame and admiration. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "coffee is on the house, for life. We were wrong. We were scared, and we were wrong." She just nodded, accepting the apology that was being offered by the entire town. She had her reputation back. She had her home. She had saved Titan. But as she sat at the counter, sipping her coffee, she knew it wasn't over. Morrison was a wealthy man. He would hire the best lawyers money could buy. He would be out on bail soon. And a man like that, a man who had everything and had lost it all, was not going to go away quietly. Justice had been served, but vengeance was still on the menu. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of peace and preparation. For the first time in over a year, Clara could wake up and not feel the immediate, crushing weight of Morrison's threat. The surveyors were gone. The threatening letters had stopped. The phone didn't ring with anonymous, menacing calls. The quiet that returned to Ironwood Creek Ranch was deep and restorative. She spent her days mending the physical scars of the conflict. The first thing she did was rebuild the corral gate, using solid oak this time, reinforcing it with steel. Every hammer blow felt like a declaration. This gate would never be broken again. Her relationship with the town was also mended. People who had once turned their backs now waved as she drove by. At the feed store, they insisted on carrying her purchases to her truck. They were small gestures, but they spoke volumes. They were apologies, acknowledgments of her strength and their own fear. Clara accepted them with a quiet nod. She held no grudges. She understood how a man like Morrison could hold an entire community hostage through economic fear. She wasn't just Clara the rancher anymore. She was a symbol of what happened when someone finally said no. But beneath the surface of this newfound peace, the war machine was still turning. 2 weeks after Morrison's arrest, she sat once again in Sam Jones's dusty office. The atmosphere, however, was entirely different. Sam wasn't weary anymore. He was energized, a shark that had tasted blood. "The district attorney's case is solid," Sam told her, pacing in front of his desk. "With Peterson's testimony and your video, Morrison is facing serious prison time for kidnapping, coercion, and bribery. Jed and the others will likely take plea deals and testify against him to save their own skins." "So he's finished," Clara said. It was a statement, but it felt like a question. "Criminally, he's in a deep hole," Sam corrected. "But our civil suit, that's where we truly bury him. The other families have all officially signed on. We're not just suing for the damages he caused them. We're going after his assets, all of them. We filed a motion to freeze the accounts of Morrison Development, arguing that they were funded by illegal activities. We're putting a lien on every property he acquired through this scheme." Clara listened, processing the new vocabulary of this war. Liens, frozen assets. This was a different kind of fight, one waged with paper and legal precedent instead of horns and hooves. "You're saying we can take it all back?" "We can do more than that," Sam said, a grim smile on his face. "We can dismantle his empire, ruin him so thoroughly that he can never use his money to hurt anyone ever again. This isn't just about getting compensation for a few families, Clara. This is about pulling the whole rotten tree out by its roots." This was the growth. Clara had started this fight to save her home. Now she was the leader of a movement to reclaim a whole county. She had wanted to be left alone, but in fighting for her solitude, she had become a champion for others. Her new role was made clear a few days later. She was at Miller's Feed and Supply when Tom Jackson and Sarah Miller approached her. They weren't just there to thank her, they looked to her for direction. "Sam told us about the plan to freeze his assets," Tom said, his voice filled with a hope Clara hadn't heard before. "Is it really possible?" "Sam seems to think so," Clara replied. "He's going to get out on bail, isn't he?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "A man with that much money? They won't keep him locked up for long." Clara looked at the fear that still lingered in their eyes. It was one thing to win a battle. It was another to convince people the war was truly over. "He might get out on bail," Clara said, her voice firm and steady, meant to reassure them as much as state a fact. "But he's not the same man he was. His name is Mud. His accounts are about to be frozen. His political friends are running for the hills. He's been exposed. A man like that, his real power was never his thugs. It was the illusion that he was untouchable. We shattered that illusion." She saw their shoulders relax slightly. They believed her because she believed it. She had faced him down and won. Her strength was now their strength. "We're with you, Clara," Tom said. "All the way. Whatever you and Sam need from us, just ask." She left the store with a new sense of responsibility. This was bigger than her now. It was for the Jacksons, the Millers, Mr. Hemlock, and all the others whose lives Morrison had broken. That night, she was sitting on her porch, watching the stars fill the vast, dark sky, when the local radio station's late news came on. Her ears perked up at the mention of a familiar name. Colonel James Morrison was released from county jail this evening after posting a $10 million bond. The announcer's voice crackled from the small radio in her kitchen. "His lawyers have issued a statement proclaiming his absolute innocence and vowing to fight what they call a malicious prosecution and a baseless civil suit. Morrison was released on the condition that he surrender his passport and remain within the state." Clara felt a cold stillness settle over her. She had been right. He was out. The money had worked its magic, as it always did. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out into the darkness that surrounded her ranch. The peace of the last few weeks suddenly felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold lake. She wasn't afraid. The fear had been burned out of her long ago. What she felt instead was a profound, unyielding resolve. Morrison was out, but he was wounded, cornered, and stripped of his public power. A cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. He wouldn't come at her with lawyers and newspapers this time. He had been humiliated publicly by a woman he saw as beneath him. His next move wouldn't be about business, it would be personal. It would be about vengeance. She whistled softly into the darkness. Out in the pasture, a low bellow answered her call. It was Titan, ever watchful. Morrison had started this war to take her land. He had escalated it to try and take her spirit. Now he was free, and he would come for her life. She looked out at the dark, empty road leading to her ranch. Let him come. He thought this was his story of revenge. He was about to find out it was hers. The news of Morrison's release spread through the county like a contagion of fear. The tentative hope that had begun to blossom in people like Tom Jackson and Sarah Miller withered. Phone calls started pouring into Sam's office, and a few people even showed up at Clara's gate, their faces pale with worry. "He's out, Clara," Tom said, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "What's to stop him from coming after us? After our families?" Clara stood on her porch, looking at the small group of frightened people. She saw Maria Sanchez, Sarah Miller, and a few other ranchers she now knew by name. They were looking to her, not as a hero anymore, but as a general, waiting for orders. "Nothing," Clara said, her voice cutting through their murmurs. "There is nothing to stop him from trying. But he's not the same man he was a month ago. He has a GPS tracker on his ankle." Sheriff Brody has a deputy posted on the main road 2 miles from here, 24/7. His every move is being watched. He's a snake, but for now, he's a snake in a glass box." Her words were a calculated mixture of truth and confidence. She knew Brody was watching him, but she also knew a man with Morrison's resources could find ways around surveillance. The real defense wasn't a deputy down the road. It was the unity of the people standing right in front of her. "We can't just wait for him to make a move," she continued, her gaze sweeping over them. "We have to be ready. Tom, you and your boys know every back road and trail in this county. I want you to organize a watch. Nothing official, just neighbors looking out for neighbors. Any strange vehicles, anyone asking questions, you report it to Brody and you report it to me." Tom nodded, a sense of purpose replacing the fear in his eyes. "We can do that." "Sarah," Clara said, turning to the young widow, "you're good with people, good at organizing. I want you to keep everyone in touch, a phone tree. If something happens at one ranch, everyone knows within 5 minutes." Sarah straightened up, her expression firming. "Yes, Mom. The rest of you," Clara said to the group, "go home, check your fences, check your locks, but don't hide, don't let him see you're afraid. We beat him in the open and we'll beat him again. Go on now." They dispersed, not with the panicked energy they'd arrived with, but with a sense of mission. Clara had turned their fear into a plan. She had transformed them from a collection of victims into a network, an unofficial militia bound by a common enemy. As they left, Sheriff Brody's car pulled up. He got out, looking tired but determined. "Just came from the courthouse," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "The judge who set his bail, Judge Miller. He's an old friend of Morrison's. The DA fought it, but his hands were tied. The 10 million is a drop in the bucket for Morrison. He's out and he's angry." "I heard," Clara said. "My neighbors are scared. They have a right to be," Brody said grimly. "We're watching him, Clara. I promise you that, but he's smart. He won't do anything himself. He'll hire it out. Someone with no connection to him. Someone desperate for cash." "So, what's the plan, Bill?" "The plan is to wait for him to make a mistake," Brody admitted, his frustration evident. "And in the meantime, you need to be careful. I can't post a deputy at your gate forever. The county won't pay for it. For the next few nights you won't be alone, but after that, you're exposed out here." Clara nodded, her eyes drifting toward the vast open pastures of her ranch. "I'm never alone out here." She began her own preparations. That evening, she walked the entire perimeter of her property. She wasn't just checking fences for cattle, she was thinking like a hunter. She noted the low points in the fence line, the culverts under the dirt road, the thick stands of trees that offered cover. She knew this land better than any man Morrison could hire. It was her greatest advantage. Her preparations weren't just defensive. Sam Jones was on the offensive. He filed an emergency motion with the court, citing Morrison's release on bail as a direct threat to the plaintiffs in the civil case. He argued that Morrison's history of witness intimidation, as proven by the incident with Peterson, made him a clear and present danger. "We're asking the judge to not only freeze his assets, but to issue a restraining order," Sam explained to Clara over the phone. "He wouldn't be allowed within 5 miles of you or any of the other plaintiffs. Judge Miller will probably deny it, but it puts Morrison on notice. It shows him we're not backing down. We're going to use the law to build a cage around him piece by piece." The next few days were tense. The community watch that Tom organized was effective. They reported a dozen different unfamiliar vehicles, most of which turned out to be innocent travelers or lost delivery trucks. But one report stood out. A beat-up, windowless van had been seen parked for hours on a ridge overlooking Clara's property. By the time a deputy got there, it was gone. It was a sign. He was scouting her. That night, Clara didn't sleep in her bed. She took a blanket and the old rifle her father had taught her to shoot with and sat in a rocking chair on her darkened porch. The night was silent, except for the chirping of crickets and the occasional low snort of a nearby cow. She wasn't waiting to be attacked. She was waiting to spring a trap. She had an idea, a dangerous one, born from a lifetime of understanding her land and her animals. Morrison had made the mistake of underestimating her once. He had made the mistake of underestimating her bull. She was going to bait him into making the same mistake again, but this time the consequences would be final. She called Sam. "Sam, I need you to do something for me. I need you to leak a piece of information. I need you to let it slip through a source you know is connected to Morrison's legal team." "Leak what?" Sam asked, his voice wary. "I want them to think I have a document," Clara said, her voice low and steady. "Something my father left me. A ledger. Something that details all the backroom deals and bribes for the last 30 years in this county. Something that implicates not just Morrison, but Judge Miller and half the county commission. Tell them I keep it hidden somewhere on the ranch." There was a long silence on the other end. "Clara, there is no ledger, is there?" "No," she said, "but Morrison doesn't know that. He's a man who ties up loose ends. He'll hear about a ledger that could destroy him and everyone who ever helped him, and he won't be able to resist. He won't send one man in a van. He'll come himself to make sure the job is done right. He'll come to my ranch to find it and to silence me for good." "This is insane," Sam said, his voice a strained whisper. "You're drawing him to you. You're setting yourself up as a target." "No," Clara corrected him, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "I'm setting a trap, and tonight the hunter is coming home." Sam Jones argued, pleaded and threatened, but Clara was immovable. Reluctantly, he agreed. He knew a paralegal in the DA's office who was known to have a loose tongue and a direct line to the gossip mill that fed Morrison's lawyers. Sam arranged a chance encounter at a coffee shop and let the rumor of the ledger slip, framing it as a bombshell piece of evidence the prosecution was holding back, something that could bring down the entire county leadership. The bait was laid. Clara spent the next 2 days in a state of hyper-awareness. Every gust of wind, every distant sound was a potential signal. She moved her herd, including Titan, into the large pasture directly behind her house. This wasn't just for their safety, it was for their proximity. They were her army, and she was positioning them for the final battle. She also called Sheriff Brody. "Bill, I need you to do me a favor," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Tonight, I need you and your deputies to be anywhere but near my ranch. I need a 5-mile dead zone. No patrols, no check-ins." "Clara, what are you planning?" Brody's voice was sharp with concern. "Morrison is looking for an excuse. If you do something, he'll twist it. He'll claim self-defense. He's coming for me, Bill, not with lawyers, not anymore. He thinks there's a ledger hidden here that can ruin him for good. He's not going to send some thug he can't trust. He'll come himself. And when he does, I need there to be no question about who was the aggressor. He needs to be caught trespassing on my land with clear intent to harm. For that to happen, you can't be here to scare him off." There was a long, tense pause. Brody was a man of the law, and Clara was asking him to step away from it, to let the pieces on the board move without his influence. "I don't like this," he said finally, "but I trust your judgment more than I trust Judge Miller's court. You have until sunrise. If I don't hear from you by then, I'm coming in with every man I've got. That's all I need," she said, and hung up. As night fell, a heavy, oppressive darkness settled over the ranch. There was no moon. Clara turned off every light in the house, making it look deserted. She sat on her porch, the old rifle across her lap, a thermos of black coffee beside her. She wasn't just waiting, she was listening. She listened to the rhythm of the crickets, the breathing of her herd, the gentle Texas wind. Around 2 a.m. the rhythm broke. The crickets went silent. Out in the pasture, a cow snorted nervously. Clara's hand tightened on her rifle. She scanned the darkness, her eyes tracing the faint outline of the fence line, and then she saw it, a flicker of movement near the south fence, the spot she'd identified as the weakest point. 2 figures dressed in black slipped through the wires. They moved with a practiced silence, but they didn't know the land. A loose rock skittered under one man's boot. They froze, listening. When the silence held, they continued, making their way toward the dark, silent house. One of them was large and moved with a familiar, brutish confidence. It was Jed. The other was leaner, more cautious, directing their movements with hand signals. Colonel Morrison. They reached the edge of the yard, staying in the deep shadows cast by an old oak tree. Clara remained perfectly still in the deeper shadows of her porch. They thought the house was the target. They were wrong. Clara raised the rifle, not to her shoulder, but pointing it at the metal roof of her barn, 50 yards away. She took a steadying breath and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the night silence. The bullet screamed off the metal roof with a loud ping, a sound designed not to hit but to announce. It was the signal. In the pasture, Titan roared. It wasn't a sound of anger this time. It was a command, a call to arms. The ground began to vibrate as 100 head of cattle surged into motion. Morrison and Jed spun around, startled by the gunshot, their eyes trying to pierce the darkness. They saw the house was still dark, but from behind it, a new sound was growing. A low, thunderous rumble. Clara stood up from her chair, a silhouette against the faint starlight. "Looking for something, Colonel?" she called out, her voice calm and carrying in the still air. Morrison saw her. His face, a pale oval in the dark, twisted in a snarl of pure hatred. He raised a pistol. "You!" he hissed. "The ledger. Where is it?" "There is no ledger," Clara said simply. "But you're right on time for the reckoning." Before Morrison could process her words, the first of the Longhorns burst from behind the house. They weren't a scattered mob. They were a disciplined wave, parting around the house and converging on the open yard, where Morrison and Jed stood frozen. Jed, remembering the last time, turned to run, but it was too late. A wall of horns and muscle blocked his path. He was surrounded. Morrison, blinded by rage and arrogance, actually fired his pistol at the nearest animal. The bullet grazed its flank, earning him a pained bellow and the full attention of the herd. Then, from the center of the charging mass, Titan emerged. He wasn't running wildly. He was trotting, his movements deliberate, his massive head lowered. His eyes were locked on the man who had shot at his herd, the man who was the source of all this pain. Clara didn't move. She just watched. This was not her fight to finish. This was justice, Texas style, delivered by the very soul of the land Morrison had tried to steal. Morrison, seeing the bull advancing on him, seeing the sea of horns closing in, finally understood. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outfought at every turn. His money was useless here. His power was an illusion. In this place, he was nothing more than prey. He let out a scream of pure terror as Titan lowered his head and charged. The ground shook. The night was filled with the thunder of hooves, the clash of horns, and the final, desperate cry of a man who had finally met a force he could not buy, bully, or beat. The impact was a sickening thud that echoed across the yard, a sound of immense force meeting fragile resistance. Titan didn't gore Morrison. It was something more primal, more absolute. He hit him with the full, solid mass of his forehead, a 2,000-pound hammer of bone and muscle. Morrison was thrown backward, his pistol flying from his hand, and he landed in a heap on the ground, motionless. The herd, agitated and flowing like a river of muscle, swirled around him, their hooves churning the dirt, their massive bodies a living wall. Jed, meanwhile, was paralyzed by terror. He hadn't run. He couldn't. He was trapped in the center of the bovine vortex. He dropped to his knees, covering his head with his arms, expecting to be trampled into the Texas dust. But the herd didn't touch him. They simply held him there, a silent, intimidating circle of guards, their dark eyes watching his every move. They were not a mindless stampede. They were a disciplined army, and their primary target had been neutralized. The thunder of hooves subsided. The cattle began to slow, their heavy breathing misting in the cool night air. The dust began to settle. Titan stood over Morrison's still form, not with aggression, but with a quiet finality, his sides heaving. He let out a low, guttural snort, a declaration of victory. Clara slowly lowered her rifle. She walked off the porch, her boots silent on the dusty ground, and moved through her herd. They parted for her, their loyalty absolute. She stopped beside Titan and placed a hand on his powerful neck. "It's over, boy," she murmured. "It's done." She looked down at Morrison. He was alive, but barely. His tailored suit was torn and filthy, and his body was twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, staring up at the starless sky, filled not with hatred anymore, but with a blank, uncomprehending shock. He had come for a ledger and found a reckoning. Clara turned her attention to Jed, who was still kneeling, trembling. "Get up," she said, her voice flat. He looked up at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. "Don't let them kill me," he whimpered. "They won't kill you unless I tell them to," Clara said, the statement hanging in the air with chilling authority. "You're going to pick him up, you're going to carry him to your car, and you're going to drive straight to Sheriff Brody's office and turn yourselves in. You will tell him you were trespassing on my property with intent to commit armed robbery and assault. You will tell him everything. Do you understand me?" Jed nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet. He looked nervously at the wall of longhorns surrounding him. Clara let out a low, two-note whistle. As if by magic, a path opened through the herd, just wide enough for Jed to pass. He stumbled over to Morrison, grunting with effort as he hoisted the broken man over his shoulder. He half dragged, half carried his boss back the way they came, toward the gap in the fence where their getaway car was presumably hidden. Clara watched them go, a procession of failure disappearing into the darkness. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel joy. She felt a profound and weary sense of finality. The war was over. The last shot had been fired, not by her rifle, but by the raw, untamable spirit of the land itself. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Sheriff Brody's car pulled up her driveway, its lights off. He got out slowly, his eyes taking in the scene, the churned-up dirt, the quiet but alert herd of cattle, and Clara standing alone in the middle of it all, her rifle held loosely at her side. "Just got a call," Brody said, his voice rough. "Jedediah Clay stumbled into my office about 30 minutes ago carrying the colonel. He's singing like a canary, confessed to everything. Trespassing, conspiracy, the works. Morrison's on his way to the hospital in Amarillo under armed guard. He'll live, but the doctors say he'll never walk again." Clara nodded. It was a fitting end. A man who had spent his life striding over others would spend the rest of his in a chair. "There was no ledger, was there?" Brody asked, though he already knew the answer. "The only records I keep are for my cattle," Clara said. Brody looked from her to Titan, who stood beside her like a loyal shadow. "The DA is going to have a field day. With Jed's confession, Morrison's violation of his bail conditions, and the testimony of all the other families, he'll be put away for so long his great-grandchildren will be old by the time he's eligible for parole. It's over, Clara. For real this time." A year later, the Ironwood Creek Ranch was thriving. The civil suit had settled for an amount that was staggering. Morrison's empire was dismantled, his assets liquidated. A large portion of the settlement was put into a trust managed by Sam Jones to help the families Morrison had ruined. The Jacksons bought back their garage. Sarah Miller was able to repurchase her family's farm. The other families were made whole, their stolen legacies returned. The land that Morrison had acquired around Clara's ranch, including the abandoned slaughterhouse, was also part of the settlement. It was deeded to a new county land trust, with Clara as the head of its board. Her first act was to have the slaughterhouse torn down, and in its place they planted a grove of oak trees. Clara's life returned to its simple rhythm, but she was no longer just a rancher. She was a guardian. The woman who had fought to be left alone had become the protector of her entire community. People came to her for advice, for help, for the quiet strength she seemed to radiate. Her ranch was no longer a fortress. It was a sanctuary. One evening, as the sun set, painting the Texas sky in brilliant hues of orange and red, she stood on her porch, watching her herd graze peacefully. Titan walked over to the fence, his great head held high. She walked down to meet him, placing her hand on his forehead. "We did it, old friend," she said softly. "We held the line." He nudged her hand, a low rumble of contentment in his chest. The land was safe. Her home was secure. And the woman who had been cornered by 14 men in a dusty corral had become a legend, a testament to the fact that true power doesn't come from money or influence, but from the unyielding courage to protect what is yours. If you watched until the end, please show your support by commenting, "I watched until the end," and consider clicking on the next video on your screen. Thank you for being with us. 5 years passed. The seasons turned over the Texas plains, each one washing away a little more of the memory of Colonel Morrison's reign of fear. The scars on the land and on the people had faded into the quiet resilience of everyday life. The Ironwood Creek Ranch was an oasis of tranquility. The oak and steel gate Clara had built stood as a quiet monument to her victory. Her herd was healthy, and Titan, now a venerable patriarch with streaks of grey around his muzzle and the calm, knowing eyes of an old warrior, spent most of his days resting in the shade of a large cottonwood tree. Clara, now in her early 60s, moved with the same steady, unhurried pace she always had, but the lines of constant tension around her eyes had softened. The fight had taken its toll, but the peace that followed had healed her. The changes in the county were even more profound. The land trust she managed had become a model of community preservation. The vast tracts of land Morrison had acquired were not sold off to the highest bidder. Instead, the trust offered long-term, low-cost leases to young families who wanted to start small-scale farms and ranches, revitalizing the agricultural community that Morrison had tried to destroy. The first beneficiary of this program was Sarah Miller. With the settlement money, she had bought back her original farmstead, and with a lease from the trust, she had expanded her operation, creating a thriving organic vegetable farm that supplied produce to restaurants as far away as Austin. Her 2 children, now teenagers, worked the land alongside her, their futures secure. Tom Jackson's garage was now Jackson & Sons Automotive, with both his boys working with him in a newly built 3-bay shop. He had become a county commissioner in the last election, running on a simple platform, never again. Sam Jones had not returned to his miserable retirement. His office, once dusty and forgotten, was now the busiest legal practice in the county. He'd hired 2 young, idealistic lawyers, and the firm Jones and Associates specialized in defending landowners against predatory developers. He had found his life's true calling in his final years, and he'd never been happier. Every year, on the anniversary of Morrison's arrest, the town held a barbecue. It took place in the new county park, on the very spot where the abandoned slaughterhouse once stood. The grove of oak trees they had planted was now tall and strong, providing shade for the picnic tables and playground. It was a place of laughter and community, its dark past erased by new life. At this year's barbecue, Clara sat at a picnic table, watching the scene. Sheriff Brody, now nearing retirement himself, was manning the grill, arguing playfully with Sam Jones about the proper way to cook a brisket. Tom Jackson was giving a speech, thanking the community for their support. Children ran through the oak grove, their shouts echoing where once there had been only silence and decay. Maria Sanchez sat down next to Clara, handing her a plate of food. "Look at what you built, Clara," she said, her voice soft with awe. Clara looked around at the thriving community, at the happy families, at the land that was now safe. "We built it," she corrected gently. "All of us." But there was one final piece to the story, a part no one in the cheerful park ever spoke of. 2,000 miles away, in a federal medical prison, was a man known only as Inmate 734. Colonel James Morrison spent his days in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, in a clean, quiet room with a window that looked out onto a manicured lawn he could never touch. His body was broken, his spine shattered in the final, violent confrontation with Titan. But that was not the worst of his prison. His assets had been liquidated, his company was bankrupt, his name was a curse. His political allies had disavowed him, and his society friends in Dallas pretended he never existed. The endless stream of high-priced lawyers had long since dried up. He was alone, stripped of the only things that had ever given him meaning, his money and his power. Every day, an orderly would bring him his meals and his medication. They never called him Colonel. They never called him Mr. Morrison. He was a number. He would sit for hours, staring at the wall, his mind a silent prison of humiliation and rage. He, who had moved mountains with a phone call, could not even stand up. He who had crushed lives for profit was now utterly dependent on the system he had once manipulated with contemptuous ease. His vengeance had not been a swift end, but a slow, living death, an eternity of powerless silence. That was the final, brutal justice the land had exacted upon him. Back at the ranch, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara stood by the fence. Titan ambled over, his great head coming to rest near her shoulder. He was older now, slower, but the bond between them was as strong as ever. She looked out over her land, the pastures bathed in the soft, golden light of dusk. She had fought for this peace, for this quiet rhythm of life. She had faced down an empire, and with the help of her community and the unshakable loyalty of her herd, she had won. Her vengeance was not in Morrison's suffering, but in her own survival and the thriving of everything he had tried to destroy. The land was still hers. The legacy of her father was safe, and the heart of Texas beat strong and free under her feet. Clara's story became a quiet legend in West Texas, a tale told on porches and in diners, a reminder that the deepest roots are not always the easiest to tear up. The tale of the vaquera who stood her ground, whose loyalty to her land was repaid in kind by the creatures she cared for, resonated far beyond the county line. It spoke to a fundamental truth, that courage, when combined with conviction, is a force more powerful than any amount of money or malice. The narrative of Clara and Titan served as a powerful lesson. It showed that true strength isn't about domination or control, but about respect and symbiosis. Clara never commanded her herd. She led them through a bond of mutual trust built over a lifetime. When she was threatened, they didn't act out of blind obedience, but from a protective instinct that recognized her as the heart of their world. This was a form of justice that couldn't be argued in a courtroom or bought with a bribe. It was as elemental as the land itself. The community she helped rebuild stood as a living testament to her victory. The land trust became a beacon of hope, proving that development and progress didn't have to mean destruction and displacement. It showed that a community could grow stronger by investing in its own people, by protecting its heritage, and by ensuring that the land was a resource for the many, not just a commodity for the few. The oak grove, once a symbol of a dark past, became a symbol of this new future, a place where roots ran deep and new growth was always possible. Colonel Morrison, in his silent prison, served as the story's cautionary postscript. His fate was a stark illustration of the emptiness of a life built on greed. He had everything money could buy, but in the end, he had nothing of real value. He had no loyalty, no community, no connection to the world beyond what he could own or control. When his power was stripped away, there was nothing left but a broken, bitter man. His punishment was not just the loss of his freedom, but the forced confrontation with his own insignificance. And what of Clara? She continued her life, not as a hero in a grand story, but as a woman content in her purpose. She found her vengeance not in the downfall of her enemy, but in the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work, in the health of her cattle, in the unwavering loyalty of her old friend Titan, and in the knowledge that the community she loved was safe and thriving. Her victory was in every sunrise she watched from her porch, every fence she mended, every new calf born into her herd. It was a victory she lived every single day. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on distant fields, but on the small patches of ground we call home. It teaches us that true allies can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the quiet strength of a single individual can be enough to turn the tide against even the most overwhelming odds. Clara Mayhew, the lone vaquera, proved that one person, standing firm in their convictions, can indeed be an army. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, loyalty, and justice. We hope Clara's story has moved you as much as it has moved us. If it has, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments what part of Clara's story resonated with you the most. And if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, show your support by commenting with the phrase, "I watched until the end." Your engagement helps our channel grow and allows us to continue bringing these important narratives to light. On your screen now, you'll see a link to another one of our videos. We think you'll find it just as compelling. Click on it to continue your journey with us. Until next time, thank you for watching.